thank you, Sue. Yes, so UX. I'll just give a brief introduction of UX design and research, and then I'll get into the positives and the challenges. So what is UX design? Well, user experience design is essentially a process, and it's a process that's about enhancing the user experience of products, websites, applications, all those sorts of things. And it's about several things, not just usability, but usability, accessibility, and pleasure with that interaction. So a lot of people know UX and think about usability, but it's actually a lot more than that. It also can be about refining current products or websites that are out there, but it could also be about designing entirely new products and experiences. While it's mainly, when we talk about UX, we mainly are talking about digital experiences. It's not necessarily limited to digital. This is most common. Often when people are talking about experiences that span non-digital, they often use the word customer experience. But if someone does say UX, it can mean non-digital as well. So how is UX research different to market research? One of the key differences is it's more about observing behaviour than asking about attitudes. Also, if we are running discussions, it's far more activity-based discussion and watching what people are doing and then asking questions around that. So an example might be, observing a user completing a task in usability testing. So a lot of the focus is in watching what the user's doing and listening to things they say around that, rather than their opinions or attitudes. Also, if you're doing contextual inquiry, for instance, you might observe how an office worker is going about their work, and you're thinking about how you can design a piece of software to support that office worker's job. The other thing is, because it generally is about delivering digital, we work in an agile environment, which is basically arranged in 2-week sprints. So we have sprint boards and all sorts of things like that, which is a bit different. We also practice, most of us anyway, a lean approach. This means when we're carrying out UX, we focus on less on documentation and far more on getting to the right design. So I'm just going to briefly talk through the process. Now this is probably for a most typical, which is where you're doing a complete redesign of such as a website. So this is a website that has already existed. You would start with clarifying objectives. So this is really being clear about what does success look like, that you can then measure at the end to see to what extent you are achieving that success. Then there's a whole range of background research. So this would include user research, but it also includes things like looking at the website metrics for the current site. Competitive analysis, so it's looking at what the competitors are doing, but it's actually more than that. It's also looking at, for the features we're interested in delivering, what other companies are doing, like what are the good ideas that are out there that we can build upon. Stakeholder interviews, understanding what the business is really looking for, and obviously I mentioned importantly doing upfront user research. Then we get into what we call design iterations. These are done per feature. So a feature might be a homepage, for instance, or a navigation design, that sort of thing. So for each feature, you would then hold a workshop with stakeholders. Usually with stakeholders, not necessarily, there could be end users, but for the most part they're stakeholders. You would actually introduce the background research and then get into coming up with ideas and I guess that initial direction that the group wants to go to for that design. And it's also about getting buy-in from the stakeholders to accept the finished design when we get there. Then the UX designer would get into the detailed design and build prototypes, which then would be tested via user research testing. Then from there, we get in refining those designs and updating the prototype and going into another round. Now, I've got here 2 rounds of testing, but it depends on the complexity of what you're designing, whether there's a need for even more than 1 round, but often 2 to 3 is pretty typical. And once you finish one feature, that feature goes off to dev to start development, while the UX team works on the next feature and so on until all the core features for the minimal viable product are completed. Then we'll do some finalizing, tweaking, and actually launch that new website. Of course, then it's important to measure the experience. So by measuring, we're talking website metrics. We might also be doing some more usability metric testing at this point. And then we get into continuous improvement, which is refining anything that we've found that's not ideal, as well as building additional features that weren't part of the minimal viable product. Now I've got here 4 types of UX research. There's actually a lot more than 4 types, but these are probably 4 that are really frequently used, at least from my perspective. So usability testing, which is very metrics based. Traditionally this is done moderated in lab-based testing, usually with around 12 users, but maybe slightly more depending on if there's more segments that are being addressed. Iterative design user testing, which is traditionally done more in a guerrilla testing. So this is what I mentioned when we were in that iterative process, is how people might have done it. The upfront research that I mentioned, typically you'd use user workshops, which are similar to focus groups, except, as I mentioned, more activity-based. Contextual inquiries and surveys, which are very similar to what you do in market research. Concept testing. So this is where I talked about a process for a website that was being reimagined. Concept testing is where you would be designing a new, so there's a new product that's going to be delivered digitally, and so there's a concept around that, and it's really about bringing that to life. So the prototype you would develop for this to test it is a bit different to the prototypes you would use in normal usability testing, where you're really testing a lot of the detailed interactions. In this case, you don't care so much about the detailed interaction. It's really about enough of a prototype to bring the concept to life and really understand if this makes sense to users and their likely, I guess, interest in that concept moving forward. So similar to product development testing that you would do a market research, except here we would actually develop a prototype. So it's all about digital UX, well, mostly, but it's less digital. Now that's, I know, a bit strange. I find it a bit strange. Traditionally, UX research has primarily been qualitative and conducted either in a lab or via guerrilla testing. Meanwhile, market research has been done digitally for years. UX research has, to far lesser extent, used digital methods in fieldwork, which personally I find really ironic, given it's all about developing digital things. We're very digital people. I'm definitely what I would call a digital nerd, yet so much of the field has not been digital. However, at Qantas Loyalty, we're very into a lean way of working and working with finite budgets, but wanting to do a lot with them. So we work in an almost 100% digital way when it comes to UX research. 2 key methods that we use that I'll talk about more in a minute: online moderated user testing as well as online unmoderated user testing. So this will help us with qualitative and quantitative needs. So firstly, I will talk about online moderated user testing. As I mentioned, this is qualitative. It involves a 2-way conversation similar to someone on Skype or FaceTime, except the user's completing tasks on a prototype, which me as a moderator would see and be able to ask questions, and we would talk about. We'd get a video recording of this entire session. It's really good for the iterative design testing that I mentioned in that process. It replaces primarily guerrilla testing, although in my perspective, because someone like of my type of, someone with a big research background, guerrilla testing wouldn't provide the robustness that I would need or things like that. So I would previously have done more in-person scheduled user testing, not necessarily metric-based usability testing for this type of work. So when I'm thinking of the positives, I'm really thinking more from an in-person, but I guess compared to guerrilla testing, this is a lot, doing it online moderated is a lot more robust. But compared to having to do it in person and moving people around, it's a lot more time effective. It's a lot quicker to organise and run. User and moderator doesn't need to travel, so if we're doing things in person, we actually need to go to the same space. We're online, everyone can log in from their own computer, they don't have to go anywhere. It's also a lot closer to realities. So the user is in their own environment and on their own device. I've actually run a session where someone was doing a test on a mobile device, and they were actually on a tram in Melbourne, and I was in my office in Sydney. So, that is where people are very likely to use that app that we were testing, is while they're on public transport. So it's quite fitting that we actually run, a test wherever they are in that environment. It's also much cheaper. There's no room hire, incentives. You only need to incentivize for the 20 to 30 minutes that you are running the session. And there's less moderator time needed because you can schedule them quite close together. I can run 6 sessions, each for 20 to 25 minutes in 3 hours, and that's all the time that's needed. Also, I can address all relevant users, not just those located in the vicinity close to my office or the room that I have hired. Someone in Perth can equally attend, or I could even address international users as well, assuming we don't have a language barrier or time zone challenges. That's what I'm thinking of. But what are the challenges? Well, probably the biggest challenge I'd say is the technology required a really decent broadband connection, and especially in Australia, a lot of people still don't have a really decent broadband connection. And by decent, I mean, you know, something that can deal with, I guess, a heavy data load. So this really does require quite a heavy data load. One of the reasons is when you're building prototypes, the focus is building them fast rather than building them so that they're efficient. So that means they're quite heavy, and they require, I guess, more data, more broadband capacity. What you're also doing is you're video recording the user, so you know you've got all that broadband. You're having a two-way voice and video sharing. You're recording their screen as well as their face and what they're saying. So there's a lot going on. And as soon as, say, the user that you have that you're testing with has less than ideal internet speed, what you find is you really start to get tech issues, and the things will drop out, like the voice will start not working, that sort of thing. And I've certainly had some pain in that space. So tech checks beforehand are really useful. You also need high quality prototypes. And this is because when you're doing it in person, you would usually design the prototype to specifically work on the computer or the mobile phone that you're testing with. However, as soon as you're relying on the user using their own device, their screen size varies a lot. And that means you really need that prototype to adapt to that screen size. Otherwise, it's a really bad experience. It's not as high as for unmoderated, and I'll get into that when I talk about that. The other thing is you don't quite get the same level of viewing as you do when users are completing it in person. And this is, you certainly see their face and their facial expressions. You can see their screen and what they're doing and hear the conversation. But you can't see the body language, and it's not quite the same as being in their space. But if I compare that to, you know, how much research and how many iterations we can do with a finite budget and time, I would certainly, I obviously do choose online moderated instead of in person. So I feel like what you're losing really is quite minimal and compared to, you know, what you gain in terms of how far the budget will stretch and your time. Moving on to online unmoderated. So this is quantitative. It involves users completing tasks again, but they're actually doing it, so tasks on a prototype, but they're doing it online without a moderator. So instead of me asking the questions or the task and getting the user to do it, they would read it similar to on a digital survey, and they would then complete that task. We get metrics of whether the user is able to complete the task, how long they took, that sort of thing. We get a video recording of the user actually completing the task, and we can see their screen and where they went, as well as their voice and face recording. As well as that, it's really good for testing concepts where you do want a quantitative sample, because you really, you know, if you're going to make a decision to spend a lot of money developing something, you want to be quite sure that this is a concept that makes sense to our user community. It's also good for conducting metric-based usability testing and for iterative design testing, especially when we're deciding between two design options. And this becomes important when you've got two different stakeholder groups that have very different opinions on what the user wants. And really having quantitative numbers behind that clearly show, what is the better direction from a customer point of view, this becomes really useful. Now this would be primarily done instead of lab-based usability testing and for concept testing. So what are the positives? There's quite a lot. Fast turnaround. You can turn it around in 24 hours. In fact, there was one time when I launched a study at 8 p.m. on Sydney time and got all the results I needed by 8 a.m. the next day. I wouldn't recommend necessarily such tight timelines, but it can be done when necessary. Also, it allows for much larger sample sizes, so much more robust, especially when we're doing real metrics. Relying on metrics from 12 or so users is really not ideal, so this makes that much more ideal. It also eliminates moderator bias. So when you're doing metric-based usability testing, it's really important for the moderators to be very neutral and ask the task and the questions in a very similar way from one user to the next test. Where if there is no moderator, that's not a concern. It will always be written in exactly the same way, in the same order. So you get the ability to get hard statistics of exactly how long users are taking to complete these sort of tasks, who's able to complete the task, that sort of thing, as well as gather other metrics. So as well as having them complete tasks, we can ask some survey-style questions, such as ease of use, directly after the task and that sort of thing. We can also get qualitative feedback to diagnose cause issues. So we get the video footage, so the software that I use, you actually, for each video, for each task, you will be able to see whether the person has passed or failed, as well as how long it took. So for a task where quite a few people failed, say, you would actually focus on looking at the videos, because you're certainly not going to sit there and watch all the videos if you have 100 users and 10 tasks, for instance. But you would watch the videos where the user has failed or the user's taken a really long time, and you can really quickly see what the issue was and work out what needs to be, how the design needs to change. Again, the user uses their own device, so they're not constrained by technology. If you do it in person, you'd typically be handing them an iPhone or an Android device, where if that's not what the user's used to, what are you really measuring? Their ability to use an iPhone versus an Android, or the actual design. In this way, it's actually on their own device, so it's more comfortable, it's more natural, it's not in a contrived environment, it's where they would do it. There's also a lot less time commitment per user. They don't need to travel anywhere, and they can do it in their own time. So if they have, if you're doing unmoderated, that would be a bit shorter than moderated. So you're talking about maybe a 10-minute session. When they have 10 minutes free, they can log in and do it, which could be at 2 in the morning if that's what they prefer. Also, we can have users from across the country, and in fact from any country. And that study I mentioned that I launched at 8 p.m, we actually had Australian users completing that till midnight, and then we switched to a sample in the UK to finish that sample requirement. So it's amazing what you can do with online and different time zones, and really being able to access all sorts of customers. Again, there are challenges. Really, you do need to build much higher quality prototypes. So in terms of the broadband capacity issues that I mentioned before, it's actually not as much an issue with unmoderated. There's a little bit less going on. However, the prototypes become even more critical. You do have to, as I mentioned before, cater to that wide variety of devices and screen sizes. But on top of that, there's no moderator to help the user get unstuck. And unlike a website, which goes through a lot of testing, and I'm not just talking about user testing, I'm talking about hardcore digital testing to make sure everything's working and nothing's breaking, that doesn't happen with prototypes. They're built fast, and it's really just to get some feedback. And so often there's little glitches and all sorts of things that don't work properly. When that happens and there's a moderator, that's not such a problem. The moderator can get them over that hurdle or get them unstuck. But when there's no moderator, that person will get stuck, and it's not a great experience. Of course, they can always abandon the task. They don't necessarily like to do that. They feel like they're not getting it, and they'll keep trying. And yes, you can really, obviously when you're all about UX, you don't really want to be giving bad user experiences that you weren't intending to. So that means you really do need to spend more time and money building and testing the prototypes to make sure they work across devices and screens, and that user isn't going to get stuck. So I'd say overall there's still a significant cost saving, but it is important to really spend a bit of extra money and time getting the prototypes right. So that's all that I'm covering today. Thank you. Back to you, Sue.